Welcome to VIVA Unscripted. My name is Josh Beckman. I am with the VIVA group, and I'm really happy to introduce Ken Cavanaugh and Donna Buckley from the FDA. Yesterday, at an incredibly interesting session, they discussed the concept of harmonization by doing. Guys, why don't you fill us in on what that really means?
Thank you, Dr. Beckman. So the basic concept of harmonization by doing is a collaboration between United States and Japan, and specifically members of the government and industry and physicians, to come up with some really practical solutions to getting safe and effective cardiovascular products to patients in both countries as quickly as possible. It's worked out pretty well because, like the United States, Japan has a fairly strict regulatory system compared to other regulatory systems in the world, but the clinical practice is very comparable to the United States. There's a very large medical device market, and so there's been a lot of incentive for companies to want to get devices on the market in both countries. And one of the hallmarks, I think, of harmonization by doing has been really the idea of we're not going to pretend to know that we know what the answers are. We are going to try to work through it by coming up with a project, and instead of just thinking at a high level, here's what could work, here's some general principles, getting into a practical approach of, when we have this device here, let's just come up with a protocol, for instance, go forward with it and learn what we learned from it and make course corrections as needed, and hopefully that information then becomes useful to other people who want to do the same thing in the future.
So let me ask this, I have two questions and that stem from that. One, where did the impetus for this kind of initiative begin? Did it begin with the companies who want to get new devices to multiple markets at the same time? Or did it come from the regulatory agencies who want to make sure that the introduction of new devices is done in the proper way, and so it's being used appropriately in different markets?
That's a good question. So harmonization by doing actually started around, I think, 2003, I would say, so quite a while ago. And as far as I can tell, it was a somewhat organic effort that came from both regulators and physicians. And I think shortly afterwards, I think industry became aware of this project and said, we have some specific projects going forward. At that time, I think it was more focused on the coronary vascular space. Over time, it's evolved to include pretty much all areas of cardiovascular. But the idea was, as you say, really to get devices on the market more quickly in both countries. I think there was the earliest, I guess, company participants were US-based companies, so I think we're looking at the Japanese market as something they'd like to enter. But at the same time, they were also looking to see if we do a global study, can that accelerate the ability to get their device on the market in the United States as well.
And how was it trying to find regulatory partners in Japan? Were they as eager to do this as you were?
In my experience, yes, they have been. I think we really developed a good collaboration with our counterparts at PMDA, kind of our counterpart agency there. They really work above and beyond to be a part of the working group calls that we have. Those always take place at strange hours just because of the time difference involved. And really, they put a lot of pressure on us as FDA. Okay, they're really driving forward this. We have to keep up with them, make sure that we keep in contact with them as well as our industry partners throughout this process. So that's really, we've kind of been at a same pace, or they're perhaps outpacing us when it comes to their energy level here.
So where do you think the pressure points are in this process? Because it sounds smooth and easy, and I'm sure there's never been any difficult conversations. When we look at this from the outside, first of all, it seems like a spectacular idea, right? Because the more people who are involved and the more cooperation that occurs, in general, the better the science and the better the understanding of a device. So where are some of the pressure points that we may not see on the outside of this process?
Okay, well, I'll just say some of the non-clinical points. I'll turn to Donna for maybe some of the clinical perspectives that come into just thinking about accepting data from outside the United States and vice versa. So I think from a process perspective, what we've had to be careful of is just being judicious, I guess, about the selection of projects and thinking about the best way to communicate. If you have regulators in one country, regulators in another country, maybe manufacturers who have representatives in one country or another, PIs in one country or another, it's going to be very hard to get everybody together for real-time conversations. And at the same time, we're not always able to wait for an email chain to reach resolution if we involve everybody. So a lot of it has just been based on the project, thinking about, okay, how should we communicate effectively here in like a less bureaucratic fashion, or just, again, pragmatically thinking, what are the steps we need to decide in order to move forward. I think one of the challenges I encountered was when we, as regulators, were talking about a given project, the manufacturer may be sitting there saying, okay, what's going on here? We're not getting any feedback. And so we realized even if we didn't have them involved in the conversation, it was really up to us to inform the manufacturers, okay, here's what we've been talking about, here's what we've decided, here's what barriers have been reduced as a result of this conversation, so they didn't think that they wanted to know kind of what the benefit was for their participation. I think over time that became a little more natural, and we understood that it's not just us, we have to worry about how other people are viewing the progress of these projects. When it comes down to, I guess, the nuts and bolts of, let's say, particular clinical collaborations and thinking about, okay, what's the minimum we can accept? What are some differences from what we expect to see that we can allow, because that's what would be more acceptable in Japan? I guess I would turn to Donna to see how you've approached those kinds of situations.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that point. There's just a general challenge, at least initially, in understanding different regulatory thresholds for approval. If you use CLI, for example, which is an area of great interest, some of the collaboration really is just trying to at least problem identify and see how we're looking at that space differently. When we're looking at, for example, let's just look at the patient population, to garner information about how are there differences in patient population, and we've been able to discern that, you know, the incidence of renal dysfunction, calcification, diabetes are far outpaced on the Japanese end, the U.S. end, and that brings recognition that a lot of our trials with some of the PAD actually exclude renal patients, which isn't something that can practically happen on the Japanese end, since it's 50% of their potentially treatable cohort. So some of those basic nuts and bolts with, let's identify the regulatory threshold, what's the patient population we're dealing with, and then the next thing is what endpoints are we looking for, and the timing of those endpoints. And using CLI again, for example, that's challenging. You know, we are going to have a safety endpoint that's going to be a little bit more acute, and then we'll have a longer-term estimate of success. But you know, what is that? You know, there's issues with patency, but that's helpful on FDA's end because that helps support the idea of mechanism of action, that the device did what it was supposed to do, which helps our regulatory threshold, which is getting a particular device on the market for a particular indication, not necessarily approving the treatment in general. But there are problems with, you know, obviously a patency endpoint. You know, do you look at, you know, perfusion measures and things like that? And so, and then what's the perfect timing of evaluating that endpoint? Is it 6 months? Is it 12 months? And there's some differences there. In terms of opinions in moving forward, and availability of imaging. We've talked about, you know, IBIS and OCT being much more heavily utilized on the Japanese end, whereas on the US end, it's more of an ultrasound-driven follow-up. And so there's a lot of practical issues that come into play, and I think as part of the process, it's really first trying to identify those touch points or those problem areas before we can kind of try to make efforts to harmonize or come up with global protocols to move the space forward.
So I think that actually brings up a really interesting point that I'm going to push you a bit on.
Sure.
Opinion is an incredibly important part of how these things move forward. And I'm sure that the people that you're engaging to run these trials on the physician side are well-known experts in their field nationally, if not internationally. How do you harmonize the opinion set of groups of people who have come from very different patient sets to get to one final? How do you bring people in a room, since they're now in Japan and the United States, and get them to, you know, argue it out and come out with one final way to go?
I mean, I think it's just a matter of ongoing discussion, really, and with any discussion on a difficult point, you usually end up at a different place that you start with, and you realize that there's a lot more in agreement that you have, then there is disagreement. I think if we talk about sort of the endpoint, I'm not sure that's really a sticky point or timing of endpoint, but if you look at 6 months or 12 months, I mean, there's value to both of those things, and I think it's figuring out how to practically harness that information that would be useful on both ends, whether it's primary assessment with a lot of supportive data later on versus vice versa. And I think there's all sorts of ways that we could, if there isn't a complete merging, there are opportunities to look from statistical approaches how to potentially meet both purposes.
And is this another method or way to test newer technologies to see if the technology being tested is of value? So you mentioned before, in the United States, we use a lot more external ultrasound, and in Japan, they use more OCT and IVUS. And there are newer devices that are coming on the market. Right now, I know that there's going to be documents coming out about the inadequacy of the measurement, say, of the foot after a CLI intervention. That we don't really have a very good standard to see if the foot is getting the flow it needs. We have surrogates.
Sure.
Right? So would this collaborative effort be another method to have sort of secondary testing of endpoint determination or methods of endpoint determination, separate from the technology itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity for learning here because nobody really does know the answer in the perfect way to really assess success. And we've been approaching it at different ways. And from a global harmonization perspective, that might not always fit as well. For example, utilization of core labs for wound assessment. I mean, that's one thing that can be additive information to support what might not be an endpoint alone that would be clinically sellable. If you have too much of a mismatch between your patency and your amputation-free survival or your TLR, there's an issue there. But back to your question, I think there's an opportunity for really learning and trying to harness the information as we go along.
All right, so actually one of the things I learned at the very beginning here is that this has sort of been developing now for 15 years. Now that you have begun this process and have a series of projects under your belt, are there other regions of the world that have regulatory frameworks similar, but maybe not as strict as we have, that are expressing interest in expanding this kind of project?
It's a good question. I think we haven't seen as much of that, at least from the standpoint of the Harmonization by Doing group. I'm sure there are manufacturers who may see that, and if there are other ideas, we're happy to hear that. I think that the challenge would then, I guess, to develop a whole new set of ties, right? Develop ties with the medical professional societies, the regulators in those countries. I think with Japan that happened. We've developed a very good relationship with them over time. And to some extent, I mean, if the clinical community or the manufacturers see great value added to those kinds of collaborations, it's stuff to be considered. Whether that would have to be HBD or some subcomponent of that, I'm not sure, because it would probably involve some very different personnel. But I mean, just from the FDA's perspective, we've tried to have more of a global footprint when it comes to leveraging clinical data from overseas, or in general finding quicker ways to get safe and effective devices out there. So if there are ways to do this based on data from other countries, whether it's pre-market data or post-market data, I'm sure that's something that our center would support.
So we have about 1 minute left. What I'd like from both of you is, where do you see this kind of work going?
I'll just start. I mean, I think it's evolved quite a bit over time. I mean, as I mentioned, it started with manufacturer-specific projects, which we still have, but over time it also involved greater regulator communication, some specific collaborative review projects, more on just general clinical study design paradigms for a given technology rather than specific devices. I think a lot of that can continue. I think we may also see more interest in just more harmonization when it comes to post-market surveillance, whether there's mechanisms for doing that and analyzing the data in some way that's useful from a regulatory perspective. I think those might be some future directions going forward. As we discussed yesterday, one other possible disease state that may be worth looking at is kidney disease. Device-based therapies for kidney disease, because that represents a huge portion of the population in both countries, in an area where I think further collaboration can really help.
And I think just to add to that really is about relationship building and communication. And you may or may not know that Ken had spent an entire year at PMDA last year, really learning some of the details of what's going on over there. So, and I think it's just a matter of momentum and continuing with that.
Well, superb. I want to say thanks very much. Both the session yesterday and I think this conversation that fills in some of the gaps is incredibly helpful for those of us that, work in the trenches and want to understand how things move forward.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're VIVA Unscripted.
Thank you.
Thank you.